Hello, welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue with our in-depth study of the book of Revelation from the New Testament. We're about halfway through. Today's lesson is number 18 in our series and covers chapter 12. This chapter is often labeled in Bibles as the woman and the beast, or the woman and the dragon. This chapter is popular among the more evangelical churches, used a lot, but used little by most other Protestant denominations. It is, however, used yearly by the Roman Catholic Church as an important reading in August on the Feast of Assumption of the Virgin Mary. The storyline started in the previous chapter and continuing on into this chapter with the persecution of the church, and some would add, and the clearing of the church from blame by Roman society continues here. It ties in closely, the reading now ties in closely with the theme of two witnesses from last week's discussion. Scholars also note we should remember that a glimpse of the seventh trumpet, the third woe, if you will, sounded at the end of last chapter. So the audience is expecting. Remember, this book's was designed to be read aloud, and so the audience would have been expecting continuation of that end. But that is not John's literary style, literary scholars teach. Instead, two flashback visions appear here. One involves a woman in labor pursued by a dragon creature that is intent on destroying her son. That dragon is identified a little later as none other than Satan. The other vision follows and involves a heavenly war that develops between the archangel Michael and Satan. That results in Satan's ejection from heaven, followed by Satan immediately threatening the world's population. Literary scholars remind us it is important to catch that these two visions are flashbacks. That is, from a literary standpoint, it opens with something that all understand has happened previously, in the past, but is very germane to the discussion. Dr. Eugene Boring and Dr. Fred Craddock, in their New Testament commentary, imply that they believe John here is trying to get his audience to take a more comprehensive view of the eschatological timing that they live in. John believes they are living in that end time, but that they are confused by what is happening. He wants them to see that what society and Rome are doing to them has been going on for a long time. They are so lost, as one other scholar says, that community seems so lost in the forest that it can not interpret the trees based on what's going on around them. Society and Rome are against God, Christ, and the church. The trouble John's Christians were encountering has deep roots in the cosmos, though, is this part of the message that John is trying to extend here, and on earth in the Roman Empire, and that empire is working directly for Satan. They are against God, Christ and the church, and are on the side of Satan. Seems to be John's context of context/time, if you will, idea. Thus, instead of the expected eschatological victory dance that you would expect if this was at the end, since the seventh trumpet has sounded back there in the end of the previous chapter, John goes elsewhere. He adds more drama and trouble. But actually, he is in the middle, several scholars point out, of the central core of his theology, of his theme in this book. John knows the decision that his Asian Christian audience, and remember now, I'm referring to Asia, a principal province in what would be Turkey today, Western Turkey, where Paul's churches were established and where other churches are there now, and John seems to have taken over somehow of those churches. That audience is confused. That's the audience that he's talking to. They have a mixed decision to make, and that concerns it's being demanded on them to accept idolatry, or what would be considered idolatry in the Christian religion. That is, to accept the Roman and pagan gods as their gods and reject their God, the Jewish God, the Christian God, if you will. But if they do that, they lose their salvation, is John's storyline. That is, do they accept society's religion and norms and worship the emperor and his gods, or do they deny that and select Christ as their Lord and worship God in heaven? Which, if they do, leads to death on earth, but salvation of their soul. To make such a decision requires the proper perspective and values. That's the storyline that scholars say John is trying to get into these people's head. To sustain the mindset that is needed and leads to salvation requires these people to see God's plan. And that is behind why John was called to heaven, or his vision is that he's called to heaven. He sees the storyline, and thus as a prophet. Understand what a prophet was understood to be. His job is to take that storyline then to the people. The prophet taking God's message to the people in real time. There seems no doubt for any Christian who knows the gospel storyline that John seems to also be using the Mary, not so much Joseph, but the Mary, Joseph, Jesus, Herod story. That seems to be buried here too. But some scholars remind us that there is likely also considerable Middle Eastern Greek mythology going on here too in the thought process, in this imagery or plot line. Maybe many scholars even argue even more so. Dr. Bruce Metzner, a Princeton theologian, in his commentary entitled Breaking the Code, says John seems to borrow both from the Old Testament and the apocryphal stories, that is, the apocalyptic line in the Old Testament and the apocryphal stories, here in his motif. That storyline had deep roots in Babylon, Persia, Egyptian and Greek mythology and extended into Roman mythology. Messner suggests God using them would have been helpful for his intended audience. These people, after all, the majority of them, they believe, are Gentile converts. They would have been told these stories, this mythological story, as children growing up, so they understood them. It's like us knowing Jack and the Beanstalk. The people of Asia Minor in 1st century AD would much more likely have known the storyline, the mythology, than they would have the story of Joseph and Mary. As there was a common sensational storyline in Near Eastern culture in 1st century AD, while the Jesus story would have been very new to them and only known probably by the Christians at minimum. Other scholars note that the Isle of Patmos, that is where the isle where John has been exiled to, was not far from a sacred island called Delos. The mythical in Greek Roman mythology culture, Delos is where their divine god Apollo was supposedly born. His mother, Leto, had fled there to give birth to escape a great dragon Python. The child she delivered was the son of their chief god, Zeus. But Python failed and Apollo survived and later returns and kills the dragon. Moreover, literary scholars say that basic plot line, using different names, is found in apocalyptic storylines and expressions of good versus evil among many peoples of the world that have had no previous exposure to Christianity or Judaism. The Roman emperor cult also used that myth line, if you will, for political advantage. So this idea was likely not so foreign to the Christians or pagans of John's time in the area where he was at. It is we moderns who find it foreign, they say, because we no longer study the classic Greek literature. It likely was not so foreign in our educated forefathers, even in this country, however, as they studied Greek and Latin literature, and they knew that literature fairly well. We see it quite often quoted and referred to up to about 1900. Several scholars suggest John here has essentially taken that Greco-Roman Middle Eastern storyline that was so common and recast it. He did that in an attempt to get his Christian audience to see their Roman oppressors as he did. That is, that they're against the Christian Lord Christ and the God in heaven. Why? Because the easy thing to do for the Christian to do in this day and time when John is writing, to improve their welfare, to improve their economic status, was to swear allegiance to the Roman emperor and gods and worship in the pagan temples, to remain loyal to Christ, as a Christian is being demanded to do for salvation purposes, and to God in heaven, was essentially an economic, social, and maybe even physical death sentence. But we have learned that an official Roman, from the official Roman communication that we studied, and I think it was our fourth lesson, that the Roman officials knew that a true Christian refused to participate in the imperial cult. Teaches Dr. Keith Harrell, from Tulane University. Thus, in the Roman eyes, Christians were atheists, he says, denying the official gods, little g that is, and thus traitors and worthy of being eliminated from their society. The Jews had a legitimate religious exemption, however. Although that exemption was weakening by 90s AD, they still could exercise that protection. But once Christianity separated from Judaism, which it had mainly done by this time, mostly done, I should say, especially this far away from Judea, Christians no longer had such protections in 90 AD. So they're at the mercy of society in the Roman cult, imperial cult, religious cult. We should note this beast seems to be the same beast that's being referred to here, the same beast that Daniel had. Clearly gets labeled Satan here, though. There is considerable Jewish and Old Testament connection also to this storyline. The phrase rules the nation with an iron rod is from Psalms 2:9, the second Psalm, verse 9. The Jews had interpreted for a long time that psalm to refer to a future Messiah. So, since this child is to rule with an iron rod, that child is the Messiah. It is thus God who intercedes here to save the child. But notice who gets the devil, or gets Satan. It's Archangel Michael handles Satan. And that Archangel Michael had long been considered by the Jews as their protectorate angel. Note then that says Dr. Brian Blount of Union Theological Seminary, that God has many servants fighting for him, while it is God who handles the salvation job. The devil also, or Satan, has his own loyal angels too. Implied here, some scholars teach, is the idea that Satan must be ejected from heaven before the end can come. Why? Because he is an obstacle to God's plan of salvation, teaches the Anglican scholar Christopher Rowland. That idea seems clearly here in verse 10, he says. That idea is being expanded from the previous chapter. He adds that how Satan is viewed throughout the Bible is variable, and we need to appreciate that. He says in the Gospels, Satan is mainly in a testing role. In Paul, he is the Lord of the outside realm and continues to threaten Christians on earth. While in the Old Testament, he is for the most part an accuser or prosecutor. So John has now left us with a key vision that Satan has been removed from preventing access to God in heaven, and our salvation, or the Christian salvation in heaven. But he is where? At the present time in John's vision here. He is loose now on earth to persecute the Christians. Thus, the Christians who must sustain their faith in the presence of that devil influencing the Roman government and society is there on earth. And yet we're only halfway through. So stay tuned. It is going to get even more complicated before we get to the end of the book. Yes, the Christian ends in the end of the book, but there's an awful lot of other things before we get there. I hope this gives you some idea of what the scholars see occurring at this point in Revelation, and hopefully we'll see you here next week to continue our discussion.